A French emperor once marched 600,000 men into Russia. 400,000 of them never came home. Most didn't die in battle. They froze, standing up, mid-step. That's not the worst story in this video. It's not even close. We're about to walk through the deadliest wars in human history, one by one, and by the end you'll understand why historians call the 20th century the century of megadeath. War is older than writing itself, but the wars that reshaped the modern world, the ones whose consequences you're still living inside right now, whether it's a border, a alliance, or a grudge, mostly happened in the last 250 years. From Napoleon's frozen retreat to trench warfare to nuclear fire to civil wars still bleeding today. This is the chain of conflicts that built and broke empires. We're going chronologically, and we're building toward the single deadliest event in recorded history. Buckle up. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River with the largest army Europe had ever assembled, the Grande Army, over 600,000 soldiers from across his empire. His goal: forced Tsar Alexander I back into a trade blockade against Britain. His method: overwhelming numbers and speed, the same formula that had crushed every European power for a decade. Russia didn't fight back the way he expected. Instead, Russian generals ordered a scorched-earth retreat, burning crops, villages, and supply depots as they pulled back deeper into their own country. Napoleon chased them for months, deeper into hostile territory, his supply lines stretching thinner with every mile. By the time he reached Moscow in September, the city was already burning, set on fire by its own governor rather than left intact for the French. Napoleon waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came. Then winter arrived early. The retreat from Moscow is one of the most catastrophic military disasters ever recorded. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers' breath froze into ice masks on their faces. Horses died by the thousands, and starving men cut into the carcasses for meat while they were still warm. At the Berezina River crossing in November, pursuing Russian forces caught the retreating French mid-crossing, and thousands drowned or were cut down trying to escape across improvised pontoon bridges that collapsed under the weight of panicking soldiers. Of the roughly 600,000 men who marched into Russia, only about 100,000 walked out. Some estimates put French and Allied deaths, from combat, cold, disease, and starvation, above 400,000. It remains one of the largest single military catastrophes in history, and it broke the myth that Napoleon was unbeatable. Within 3 years, he'd be defeated for good at Waterloo. But if you think freezing to death standing up is the worst way soldiers died in these wars, you have no idea what's coming in the trenches. 50 years later, a different kind of war broke out, not between empires, but inside one country, over one core question. Would the United States remain half slave and half free? By 1861, 11 southern states had seceded to form the Confederacy, determined to preserve slavery as the Union pushed toward abolition. What followed was 4 years of brutal civil war, and it introduced the world to something new: industrial-age combat, with rifled muskets accurate at hundreds of yards, but Napoleonic-era tactics of marching men shoulder to shoulder into open fields. September 17, 1862, Antietam Creek, Maryland, the single bloodiest day in American history. In 12 hours, roughly 22,700 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. Entire regiments were wiped out crossing a single cornfield. A Union officer later wrote that the corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, not by farm tools, but by bullets. Then came Gettysburg, July 1863, 3 days, over 50,000 casualties combined, the turning point of the war. Pickett's charge alone sent roughly 12,500 Confederate soldiers across nearly a mile of open ground directly into Union cannon and rifle fire. More than half of them didn't make it back. By the war's end in 1865, an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers had died. More American deaths than in every other American war combined, up through Vietnam. Slavery was abolished. But the wounds of that war, political, cultural, and literal, are still visible in America today. Not every war gets a Hollywood movie. Let's move fast through 3 conflicts that quietly reshaped the map. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. Prussia crushed France in under a year, captured Napoleon III himself at the Battle of Sedan, and used the victory to unify Germany into a single empire for the first time in history, the empire that would go on to fight 2 world wars. The Paraguayan War, 1864 to 1870, in South America. Paraguay took on Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay simultaneously. By the end, some historians estimate Paraguay lost over half its total population, including up to 90% of its adult male population. It remains one of the most disproportionately devastating wars for a single nation in modern history. The Taiping Rebellion in China, 1850 to 1864. A civil war sparked by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Estimated death toll, 20 to 30 million people. To put that in perspective, that's more deaths than World War I. So far we've covered empire-breaking cold, brother against brother slaughter, and a rebellion led by a man who thought he was Christ's sibling. But every war you've heard so far was fought with rifles and cannons. What happens when you add machine guns, poison gas, and millions of men stuck in trenches for years? That's next. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. A 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shoots and kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. One assassination. 1 month later, the alliance system that had kept Europe's peace for decades instead dragged nearly the entire continent into war within weeks. This wasn't the fast, decisive war anyone expected. By late 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a line of trenches stretching over 700 kilometers from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers lived in mud, disease, and constant artillery fire for years, gaining or losing mere meters of ground at horrific cost. The Battle of the Somme, July 1, 1916. On the very first day, British forces suffered roughly 57,000 casualties, nearly 20,000 killed, in a single morning. It remains the single bloodiest day in British military history. The battle dragged on for over 4 months and moved the front line about 10 kilometers. Total casualties on both sides, over 1 million. Verdun, fought the same year, lasted almost 10 months and produced roughly 700,000 to 976,000 casualties over a battle for territory that, strategically, barely mattered. French General Robert Nivelle summarized the horror with the phrase "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass, a line of defiance built on unimaginable death. Then came the gas. Chlorine gas, then phosgene, then mustard gas, chemical weapons that burned lungs and skin, blinded men, and killed slowly over days. Soldiers described watching gas creep across no man's land as a yellow-green fog, with no way to outrun it in waterlogged trenches. By the armistice on November 11, 1918, an estimated 8.5 to 10 million soldiers had died, and roughly 6 to 13 million civilians. An entire generation of young European men was gone. And the peace treaty that ended it, the Treaty of Versailles, planted the seeds for something even worse 21 years later. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It ended nothing. In fact, the very treaty meant to prevent another war is what many historians blame for causing the next one, the deadliest conflict in human history. Between the 2 world wars, the world didn't actually rest. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, following the Bolshevik Revolution, Red Army against White Army, with foreign powers intervening on both sides. Estimated deaths, including famine and disease, 7 to 12 million people. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, a dress rehearsal for World War II, where Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy backed General Francisco Franco's nationalists, while the Soviet Union backed the Republicans. The bombing of the town of Guernica in 1937, a civilian target with no military garrison, killed hundreds of civilians in a single afternoon and became the subject of Picasso's most famous painting. And already brewing in Asia, the Second Sino-Japanese War, starting in 1937, would kill an estimated 15 to 20 million Chinese people before it merged directly into World War II. Every war we've covered so far was horrifying on its own. But none of them, combined, come close to what happens when all of these tensions detonate at once, across 6 continents, for 6 straight years. September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war. Within 2 years, the conflict spans Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific simultaneously, the only truly global war in human history. But the deadliest single theater of the entire war was the Eastern Front, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion force ever assembled, over 3 million German and Axis troops, betraying the non-aggression pact he'd signed with Stalin less than 2 years earlier. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, became the turning point. Soviet and German forces fought house to house, floor to floor, sometimes room to room, in a city reduced to rubble. Life expectancy for a newly arrived Soviet soldier at Stalingrad's front line was measured in hours, not days. When the German Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, against Hitler's direct orders, of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner, only about 5,000 to 6,000 would ever return home. Most died in Soviet captivity. Total combined deaths at Stalingrad alone, estimated between 1.7 and 2 million. That single battle killed more people than the entire American Civil War. The Eastern Front as a whole would ultimately account for the majority of all World War II military deaths. The Soviet Union alone lost an estimated 8.7 million soldiers and up to 19 million civilians, roughly 27 million people total, more than any other nation in the war. And that's just the ground war in Europe. We haven't even gotten to the Holocaust, the firebombing of Japan, or the 2 bombs that ended it all. That's where this gets even darker. Behind the front lines, Nazi Germany carried out the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, alongside millions of Roma people, disabled people, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by the regime. Extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau were built specifically for industrialized killing. At Auschwitz alone, historians estimate over 1.1 million people were murdered, the vast majority within hours of arrival by train. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan's war against China, and later the United States and Britain, produced its own horrors. The Nanjing Massacre of 1937 saw Japanese forces kill an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over roughly 6 weeks, alongside mass sexual violence documented by international observers who were present in the city at the time. By 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the war entered a new phase of destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more immediate deaths than either atomic bomb would cause. Napalm-based incendiary bombs were dropped specifically to ignite the wood and paper construction of Japanese homes, creating a firestorm that superheated the air and asphyxiated people even in shelters and canals. Then, August 6 and 9, 1945, the United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima's bomb killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly, with the total death toll, including radiation sickness in the following months, reaching approximately 140,000 by the end of that year. Nagasaki's bomb killed roughly 40,000 to 70,000 more. Survivors described a blinding flash, then a wave of heat that vaporized people so completely that only shadows burned into stone remained where they had been standing. World War II's total death toll, combining military and civilian deaths worldwide, estimated between 70 and 85 million people, roughly 3% of the entire global population at the time. It remains, by a wide margin, the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II ended in 1945. But peace didn't actually arrive, it just changed shape. The next wars wouldn't be fought between empires. They'd be fought between ideologies, using other countries as the battlefield. Just 5 years after World War II ended, Korea, freshly divided between a Soviet-backed North and an American-backed South, exploded into open war. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel. What followed was a brutal 3-year seesaw. American and UN forces were nearly pushed off the peninsula entirely, cornered into the Pusan perimeter, before General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 turned the tide dramatically, cutting off North Korean supply lines in one of the most daring military gambits of the century. But when UN forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, China entered the war directly, sending hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River. At the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in the brutal North Korean winter of 1950, roughly 30,000 UN troops were surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures reaching -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze. Wounds froze shut before they could bleed out, which, gruesomely, saved some lives even as frostbite claimed limbs by the thousands. The war ground into a stalemate near the original border, and an armistice was signed in July 1953, but no peace treaty. North and South Korea remain, technically, still at war today. Total deaths across military and civilian casualties, estimated 3 to 4 million people, on a peninsula smaller than the state of Minnesota. If Korea was a stalemate, Vietnam was a slow bleed. What began as a French colonial war became an American one after French forces were decisively defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The U.S. escalated its involvement through the 1960s to prevent what policymakers called the domino effect of communism spreading through Southeast Asia. Vietnam introduced a new kind of nightmare for American forces. An enemy that didn't fight in open battles, but through jungle ambushes, tunnel networks, and guerrilla tactics that made front lines meaningless. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 saw North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launch coordinated surprise attacks on over 100 cities and towns simultaneously, including a direct assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, it was a defeat for the North. Politically, it shattered American public confidence that the war was winnable, because footage of the attacks broadcast into American living rooms told a very different story than official briefings had. The use of Agent Orange, a chemical herbicide sprayed across roughly 4.5 million acres of Vietnamese jungle to destroy enemy cover and crops, is still causing birth defects and health problems in Vietnamese communities today, more than 50 years later. An estimated 3 million people, including U.S. veterans, are believed to have been affected by its exposure. By the time the last American helicopters lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on April 30, 1975, the iconic image of desperate evacuees clinging to the skids, the war had killed an estimated 58,000 American service members and somewhere between 1.3 and 3.8 million Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian people combined. And Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia, was about to suffer something arguably even darker, a genocide committed not by an invading army, but by its own government against its own people. The Cold War didn't stay confined to Korea and Vietnam. Let's move fast through the conflicts it fueled around the globe. The Cambodian Genocide, 1975 to 1979. The Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot attempted to forcibly transform Cambodia into an agrarian utopia, executing intellectuals, city-dwellers, and anyone wearing glasses. Glasses were treated as a sign of education, and therefore a threat. Between 1.5 and 2 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from execution, forced labor, and starvation in less than 4 years. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, triggering an 8-year war that saw trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, alongside chemical weapon attacks on both soldiers and civilians. Estimated deaths: 500,000 to over 1 million. The Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. The Soviet Union's own decade-long quagmire, where US-backed Mujahideen fighters, using weapons supplied covertly by the CIA, eventually forced a Soviet withdrawal, contributing directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. An estimated 1 to 2 million Afghan civilians died. Notice the pattern. By the late 20th century, wars weren't just killing soldiers anymore. Increasingly, the deadliest wars were turning citizens against each other, inside their own borders. That pattern was about to explode in Africa and Europe simultaneously. In just 100 days, between April and July 1994, extremist Hutu militias in Rwanda killed an estimated 800,000 to 1 million ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, using primarily machetes, not guns. That's a killing rate faster, per day, than the Holocaust. The genocide was fueled for months in advance by radio broadcasts on radio television Libre des Mille Collines, which referred to Tutsis as Inyenzi, cockroaches, dehumanizing an entire ethnic group in the public consciousness before a single machete was raised. Neighbors killed neighbors. Roadblocks were set up across the country specifically to check identity cards for ethnicity, and anyone marked Tutsi was killed on the spot. The international community largely stood by. A small UN peacekeeping force under Canadian General Romeo Dallaire had warned of the coming genocide in a cable sent months earlier, a cable that was, by his own account, effectively ignored by UN headquarters. His forces were under-resourced and under a mandate that prevented direct intervention until it was far too late for hundreds of thousands of victims. Just as Rwanda's genocide unfolded, a different ethnic war was tearing apart the former Yugoslavia in the heart of Europe, a continent that many believed had learned its lesson after 1945. As Yugoslavia fragmented into independent states through the early 1990s, ethnic and religious tensions between Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks exploded into open war, marked by a deliberate strategy that became internationally infamous: ethnic cleansing, the forced removal or extermination of a population based purely on their ethnicity. The siege of Sarajevo lasted nearly 4 years, from 1992 to 1996, the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare history. Snipers targeted civilians crossing the street, an area residents nicknamed Sniper Alley, and residents lived under near-constant mortar fire for over 1,400 days. Then, in July 1995, came Srebrenica. Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic overran a UN-declared safe area that was supposedly protected by Dutch peacekeepers. Over the following days, approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically separated from women and executed, the worst massacre on European soil since World War II. It was later formally recognized by international courts as genocide. We've covered wars fought over land, ideology, ethnicity, and religion. But our final stretch takes us into wars still unfolding right now, conflicts so recent, the death tolls are still climbing as you watch this. August 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades Kuwait, triggering a US-led coalition response, Operation Desert Storm, that liberates Kuwait in a rapid, decisive ground campaign lasting just 100 hours in February 1991, after weeks of devastating air campaign. It showcased a new era of precision-guided warfare broadcast live on CNN, transforming how the world watched wars unfold in real time. Then, September 11, 2001. Nearly 3,000 people are killed when hijacked planes strike the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and crash in a Pennsylvania field. Within a month, the US invades Afghanistan to root out al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government sheltering them, beginning what would become America's longest war, lasting nearly 20 years until the chaotic withdrawal in August 2021. In 2003, a separate US-led invasion of Iraq, justified by since-discredited claims of weapons of mass destruction, toppled Saddam Hussein but triggered years of sectarian civil war and insurgency. Combined, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are estimated to have killed several 100,000 people directly, with some broader estimates, including indirect deaths from displacement, disease, and infrastructure collapse, reaching into the millions. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Add up every major war of the 20th century alone, both world wars, Korea, Vietnam, the genocides, the civil wars, the proxy conflicts, and conservative historical estimates put the total dead at somewhere between 100 and 200 million people. Some estimates that include famine and disease caused directly by these conflicts push that number well past 200 million. That means roughly 1 out of every 20 to 30 human beings alive at some point during the 20th century died as a direct or indirect consequence of organized warfare. World War II alone, in 6 years, killed more people than the entire Black Death plague killed across an entire continent over a century. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Nuclear weapons that exist today, thousands of them, held by 9 countries, are, warhead for warhead, dramatically more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A single modern strategic warhead could kill more people in seconds than the entire Battle of the Somme killed in 4 months. We built the tools to end World War II's death toll in an afternoon, and we've never stopped building more of them since. Every war on this list started the same way every war always starts, with someone convinced that violence would finally solve the problem. It never fully does. It just writes the next chapter. The scariest part of studying military history isn't the past. It's realizing how familiar the warning signs still look today. If the number of soldiers who froze standing up in Napoleon's retreat got to you, wait until you see what really happened inside the Chernobyl disaster. A catastrophe with its own death toll still debated to this day. Drop a comment. Which of these wars did you know the least about before watching? Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss Chernobyl, the disaster they tried to hide, releasing soon.